Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The old house sighed around me, a familiar chorus of creaks and groans that had become the soundtrack to my days. It wasn't an unhappy sound, not really. More like the gentle settling of bones, a comfortable reminder of the years lived within its walls. My name is Eleanor, and I've lived in this house on Willow Creek Lane for the better part of 30 years. Seen seasons change, fashions come and go, and the faces in the neighborhood evolve. My own face, reflected in the dusty hallway mirror, showed the roadmap of those years too. A few more lines around the eyes, a softer jawline than the girl who first moved in, full of bridal dreams and renovation plans. My husband, Tom, had been gone for 5 years now. The silence he left was the loudest thing in the house initially, a roaring void. But time, as it does, had smoothed the raw edges of grief, leaving a dull ache that flared up mostly on anniversaries or when a specific memory, triggered by a scent or a song, ambushed me. Life had found a new rhythm, quieter, more solitary. Not necessarily lonely, I'd tell myself. I had my books, my garden, my weekly calls with my daughter, Clara, who lived 2 states away. My neighbor to the right was Mr. Henderson, or Arthur, as I'd learned he preferred to be called after a few hesitant conversations over the very hedge I was currently attempting to tame. He'd moved in about a year after Tom passed. A quiet man, kept to himself mostly. I knew he was retired, like me. He'd been a librarian. Someone had mentioned at a neighborhood potluck I'd reluctantly attended. It suited him, I thought. He had that thoughtful, observant air about him. His garden was immaculate, a stark contrast to my own slightly wilder patch of earth, which I liked to think had character. We exchanged polite nods, occasional brief chats about the weather or the errant squirrel that terrorized both our bird feeders. Nothing more. He wasn't unfriendly, just contained. This particular afternoon, the late spring sun was warm on my back, a gentle caress that eased the stiffness in my shoulders. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn branch of the climbing rose that threatened to engulf the mailbox. It was a beautiful rose, Tom's favorite, a vibrant crimson that bled color into the otherwise muted green of the privet hedge separating our properties. I snipped and pulled, beads of sweat gathering on my forehead. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the sweet perfume of the lilacs blooming by my porch. It was peaceful, the kind of day that made you believe everything was right with the world, even if your own little corner of it felt a bit too quiet sometimes. I remember tugging at a thorny vine, muttering under my breath, when I heard a soft cough behind me. Startled, I nearly dropped my shears. I turned, a little flustered, to see Arthur standing there, on his side of the low hedge. He was holding a small, terracotta pot with a delicate-looking fern nestled inside. "Eleanor," he said, his voice mild, a little hesitant. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Oh no, Arthur, not at all," I replied, trying to smooth down my windswept hair with the back of my gardening glove. "Just doing battle with this overly enthusiastic rose." He offered a small, shy smile. "It's a beautiful bloom. Vigorous. That's one word for it," I chuckled. "More like a botanical bully sometimes." He looked down at the pot in his hands. I was repotting some of my ferns and this one. Well, I seem to have an extra. I know you enjoy gardening. I wondered if you might like it." It was a simple gesture, unexpected. Our interactions had always been so fleeting, so neighborly in the most superficial sense of the word. This felt different, somehow, more personal. "Oh, Arthur, that's so thoughtful of you," I said, genuinely touched. "It's lovely. Are you sure?" "Quite sure," he said, his gaze meeting mine for a brief moment before flicking back to the fern. "It needs a good home, and I've seen how you care for your plants." I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a pleasant surprise. "Well, thank you. I'd be delighted. I think I have just the spot for it on the shaded side of the porch." He stepped closer to the hedge, looking for a gap to pass the pot through. I moved towards him, reaching out. Our hands met over the leafy boundary, his fingers brushing mine as I took the cool ceramic. It wasn't a dramatic touch, not a spark in the way romance novels describe. It was a connection, a brief, feather-light contact, skin against skin. But in that tiny moment, something shifted. It was like a faint electrical current, a hum I hadn't realized was absent until I felt it. His hand was dry, slightly calloused, the hand of someone who worked with earth and paper. My own, still in its loose gardening glove, felt clumsy in comparison. The sensation lingered even after our hands parted, a strange, warm imprint. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He just smiled again, that quiet, almost apologetic smile. "Good. I'm glad." "Thank you again, Arthur," I said, my voice perhaps a little breathier than usual. I cradled the fern. "It's very kind." "My pleasure, Eleanor." He gave a small nod, a little wave, and then turned back towards his own neat garden, leaving me standing there by the unruly rose bush, the terracotta pot feeling surprisingly significant in my hands. The sun still shone, the birds still chirped, but the air around me felt different, charged with a subtle new energy. It was the simplest of things, a shared interest, a small gift, a fleeting touch of hands. But as I walked back to my porch, the little fern feeling cool against my palms, I had a premonition, a whisper in the quiet of my heart, that this tiny, everyday encounter was anything but ordinary. It felt like the first page of a new chapter, one I hadn't even realized I was waiting to begin. The scent of lilacs seemed sweeter, the silence of the house less empty, more expectant. I couldn't explain it, not then. I just knew that something in that gentle brush of hands over a gifted fern had indeed changed. The fern found its place on a wicker table on my porch, just out of the direct sun, as promised. I watered it carefully, my thoughts still replaying that brief moment at the hedge. It was silly, really. A man gives his neighbor a plant. Happens all the time. But it wasn't just the plant, was it? It was the way he'd looked a little shy, the unexpectedness of the gesture from someone I'd mentally cataloged as the quiet man next door. And then there was that touch. I kept coming back to that. It wasn't romantic, not in any overt sense. I wasn't some giddy teenager. I was Eleanor, a woman who'd lived a life, loved, lost, and settled into a comfortable, if predictable, groove. But the touch had felt alive. It had stirred something dormant, a sense of connection to another person that I hadn't realized I'd been missing quite so acutely. Later that evening, as dusk began to paint the sky in soft lavender and rose, I found myself glancing out the window towards Arthur's house more than once. His lights were on, casting a warm glow from his living room window. I imagined him in there, perhaps reading, surrounded by his books and his orderly life. What did he think about? Did he have family? Friends? For the first time, he wasn't just Mr. Henderson, the neighbor. He was Arthur, a man who had an extra fern and had chosen to give it to me. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the porch, the new fern nearby. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine from a few houses down. The crickets had started their nightly symphony. It was a typical evening, yet it felt imbued with a quiet anticipation. I hadn't felt this way in years. Not since Tom, not since. Well, not for a very long time. It wasn't excitement, not exactly. It was more a feeling of gentle curiosity, a sense of a door creaking open just a tiny bit, showing a glimpse of something new beyond it. And it all started with a simple fern and a touch of hands over a garden hedge. I smiled to myself, a small, private smile. Perhaps, I thought, even quiet lives on quiet streets could hold their own surprises. The next morning, I woke with a subtle sense of lightness I hadn't felt in ages. It was peculiar, this shift in my internal weather, all stemming from such a small incident. As I went about my usual routine, coffee, morning paper, a bit of tidying, I found my gaze drifting to the fern on the porch. It looked healthy, green, and content in its new spot. A silent, leafy reminder of yesterday's brief connection. I decided to bake some lemon poppy seed muffins. Baking was something I used to do a lot when Tom was alive, and for the kids when they were younger. Lately, it seemed too much bother for just one person. But today, the urge was there. Maybe it was the sunshine or the lingering warmth from Arthur's gesture. As I measured flour and zested lemons, the kitchen filled with a bright, cheerful aroma. And I found myself thinking, perhaps I'll take one over to Arthur. A thank you for the fern, a neighborly gesture in return. The thought made me a little nervous, which was ridiculous. I was a grown woman. Taking a muffin to a neighbor was hardly a momentous event. Yet my heart did a little flutter kick. It was the thought of initiating contact, of stepping slightly outside my comfortable, solitary routine. The hedge had been a literal and metaphorical boundary. He had crossed it in a small way by offering the fern. Now, perhaps, it was my turn. Once the muffins were out of the oven, golden brown and fragrant, I arranged a few on a small plate, covered them with a clean tea towel, and took a deep breath. Right, Eleanor, I muttered to myself. Just a muffin. I walked across my lawn, the grass still damp with morning dew. His house looked just as neat and tidy from the front as it did from the back. Well-tended flower beds, a freshly painted porch. I hesitated for a moment on his doorstep, then gave a light knock. I heard footsteps, and then the door opened. Arthur stood there, looking slightly surprised to see me. He was wearing a simple collared shirt and slacks, his silver hair neatly combed. He held a book in one hand, a finger marking his place. "Eleanor," he said, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Pleasure? Or just polite acknowledgement? Good morning." "Good morning, Arthur," I replied, trying to sound casual. I baked some muffins this morning, and I thought you might like one. As a thank you for the lovely fern. It's settling in beautifully on the porch." I held out the plate. His expression softened, that quiet smile appearing again. "Lemon poppy seed? That's very kind of you, Eleanor. And one of my favorites, as it happens. Please come in for a moment, if you have time." The invitation was unexpected. I'd planned to just hand over the muffins and retreat. "Oh, well, just for a minute then. If you're sure I'm not interrupting your reading." "Not at all. A welcome interruption." He stepped back, holding the door wider. His living room was just as I'd imagined, in a way. Bookshelves lined almost every wall, filled to capacity. Comfortable, slightly worn armchairs. A lingering scent of old paper and lemon polish. It was a cozy, intellectual haven. Not sterile, but thoughtfully organized. There were no family photos immediately visible, I noticed, but there were several interesting pieces of art on the walls, prints of botanical drawings and old maps. "Please, have a seat," he gestured towards an armchair. "Can I offer you some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "Oh, no, thank you. I've had my fill this morning," I said, settling into the chair. It was surprisingly comfortable. Your home is lovely, Arthur. So many books." He chuckled, a soft, warm sound, a professional hazard, I suppose, and a lifelong passion. "They're good company." "I agree," I said, "though my collection is a bit more chaotic." He took the plate of muffins and placed it on a small side table. "These smell wonderful." "Thank you again." He picked one up. "May I?" "Of course." He took a bite, and his eyes closed for a moment in appreciation. "Delicious, Eleanor. Truly, you have a gift." I felt a blush creep up my neck. It was such a simple compliment, but his sincerity made it feel significant. "It's just an old recipe." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, him savoring the muffin, me taking in the quiet atmosphere of his home. It was so different from my own, which, despite my efforts, still bore the imprint of family life, of Tom's presence, of lingering memories. Arthur's home felt like his own, curated by a singular taste and a quiet life. "So, a librarian?" I ventured, remembering the snippet of information. He nodded. "For 40 years. University library, mostly. I retired last spring." "Do you miss it?" He paused, looking out the window for a moment, as if considering the question carefully. "I miss parts of it. The smell of the archives. The thrill of finding a rare first edition. Helping students find just the right piece of information." But he turned back to me, a faint smile on his lips. "I don't miss the budget meetings, or the endless cataloging system updates." I laughed. "I can imagine." "And you, Eleanor? You're retired too, I gather." "Yes, I was a primary school teacher. 2nd grade, mostly. I loved it, but it was time. The energy levels required." I trailed off, smiling. "Ah, shaping young minds. A noble profession," he said. "More demanding than dusty books, I'm sure." "Both have their rewards, I expect," I replied. We talked for a little while longer, about books we'd read, about the changing neighborhood, about the surprising tenacity of dandelions. It was easy conversation, flowing naturally, without any awkward silences. I learned he'd moved here from a busier part of the state after his retirement, seeking a quieter pace. He didn't mention a wife or family, and I didn't pry. It wasn't my place. But I found myself wanting to know more about this gentle, thoughtful man who lived next door, who liked lemon poppy seed muffins and had given me a fern. When I finally stood to leave, feeling I'd taken up enough of his morning, he walked me to the door. "Thank you again for the muffins, Eleanor. It was a real treat. And thank you for the fern, Arthur, and for the conversation." "The pleasure was all mine." He paused, then added, "Perhaps we could share a cup of coffee sometime, in a more planned fashion." My heart gave another little leap. "I'd like that very much, Arthur." "Wonderful. I'll be in touch." As I walked back to my own house, the sun felt warmer, the colors in my garden seemed brighter. The world hadn't changed, not really, but I had, or at least something within me had. A small seed of connection, planted by a fern and nurtured by a muffin and a quiet conversation, was beginning to sprout, and I found myself looking forward to whatever might grow from it. The silence in my house when I stepped back inside didn't feel quite so profound anymore. It felt expectant, waiting, just like me. The days that followed had a new texture to them. The quiet anticipation I'd felt after receiving the fern didn't dissipate. Instead, it settled into a gentle undercurrent in my daily life. I found myself noticing small things, the way the light hit Arthur's wind chimes in the late afternoon, the particular shade of blue of the hydrangeas he was carefully tending near his porch. These weren't obsessive thoughts, just a heightened awareness, a subtle shift in focus from my own inner world to the small details of the world outside, particularly the corner of it occupied by my neighbor. A few days after the muffin exchange, a small handwritten note appeared in my mailbox. Not tucked in with the bills and flyers, but placed carefully on top. The handwriting was neat, slightly old-fashioned, unmistakably Arthur's. It simply read, "Eleanor, would you be free for that coffee on Friday morning? Perhaps around 10? My porch, if the weather holds. Arthur." My porch, if the weather holds. It was such a simple, unassuming invitation, yet it made me smile all day. Friday. That gave me 2 days. 2 days to? Well, I wasn't sure what. It wasn't a date, not in the way I remember dates from my youth, or even the occasional awkward set-ups friends had tried to arrange after Tom passed. This felt different, gentler, just coffee. With Arthur. On Friday morning, I took a little more care with my appearance than usual. Nothing dramatic, just a nicer blouse, a touch of lipstick I rarely bothered with anymore. I told myself it was just to feel presentable, but a small, honest voice inside admitted I wanted to look nice asterisk for him asterisk. The weather, thankfully, was holding beautifully. A perfect late spring morning, sunny with a light breeze that rustled the leaves in the old oak tree at the end of the street. At precisely 10 o'clock, I walked over. Arthur was already on his porch, which was a mirror image of mine, but furnished with sturdy, dark wicker chairs, and of course, more plants. A small table was set with 2 mugs, a steaming coffee carafe, a small pitcher of cream, and a plate of what looked like homemade shortbread cookies. "Good morning, Eleanor," he greeted me, rising from his chair. He was wearing a crisp, pale blue shirt, and he looked nice, relaxed. "Good morning, Arthur." "This is lovely," I said, gesturing to the setup. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "No trouble at all. A pleasure." He gestured for me to sit. "And I must confess, your muffins inspired me. These are my attempt at shortbread. A bit rustic, I'm afraid. They look wonderful," I assured him, and they did. He poured the coffee, rich and dark, the aroma mingling with the scent of his well-tended garden. We sat, sipping our coffee, making small talk initially. The weather, a noisy blue jay that was squawking indignantly from a nearby tree, the progress of my battle with the crimson rose. But gradually the conversation deepened, meandering like a slow river. He asked about Clara, my daughter, and listened with genuine interest as I talked about her work as a veterinarian and her 2 boisterous rescue dogs. I found myself sharing anecdotes I hadn't recounted in years, feeling a lightness in the telling. He, in turn, spoke a little about his career, the changes he'd seen in the world of libraries and information. He mentioned a sister who lived in Oregon, whom he visited once a year. He spoke of her fondly, but there was a hint of melancholy when he talked about family, a subtle sense that he, too, understood solitude. There were moments of comfortable silence, too. We'd watch a bee bumble amongst his lavender bushes, or listen to the distant sound of children laughing. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a shared quiet, a sense of mutual ease that was surprisingly profound. I realized how long it had been since I'd simply sat with another person, a man, and just been. Without expectation, without the weight of shared history or unspoken grief. At one point, he was talking about a particularly memorable rare book he had once acquired for the university library, a medieval manuscript with exquisite illuminations. His eyes lit up as he described it, his hands subtly gesturing as if he could still feel the ancient vellum. "It sounds fascinating," I said, You must miss having access to such treasures." He looked at me, his gaze direct and thoughtful. "I do in some ways. But," he paused, a small smile playing on his lips, "there are other kinds of treasures, aren't there? Smaller, perhaps, but no less valuable." His eyes flicked briefly around his garden, then met mine again. I felt that now familiar warmth spread through me. His words, simple as they were, resonated deeply. He understood. He saw value in the quiet moments, in the beauty of a well-tended garden, in a shared cup of coffee on a sunny morning. As I was about to take a sip of my coffee, my hand brushed against his as we both reached for the plate of shortbread cookies at the same time. Another accidental touch, lighter even than the one over the hedge. Just a fleeting contact of our fingers. But this time, I was more aware, more attuned to the sensation. His skin was warm. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then, as if by mutual, unspoken agreement, we both drew our hands back slightly, a little ripple of awareness passing between us. "Oh, excuse me," I murmured, feeling a faint blush. "My apologies," he said, his voice equally soft. He picked up a cookie and offered the plate to me. "Please." Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw something flicker in his, a reflection of the same subtle electricity I felt. It wasn't just politeness. It was recognition, an acknowledgement of that tiny, invisible spark. The conversation resumed, perhaps a shade more careful for a few moments, but the ease soon returned. Yet something had subtly shifted again. That second touch, as brief and inconsequential as it might seem, had confirmed the quiet hum of connection I'd felt before. It was real. And it was nice. More than nice. It was like finding a hidden spring in a familiar landscape, cool and refreshing. When it was time for me to leave, an hour and a half later, I felt a reluctance I hadn't anticipated. "Thank you for the coffee, Arthur," I said, standing up, "and the delightful company. Your shortbread is excellent, by the way. Far from rustic." "The pleasure was all mine, Eleanor," he replied, walking with me to the edge of his porch. Perhaps he hesitated, then continued, a hopeful note in his voice, "We could do this again sometime." "I would like that very much," I said, and this time the words came out with more confidence, more certainty. As I walked back to my own house, I felt a lightness in my step, a song in my heart that had been silent for too long. The world around me seemed to be humming with a gentle energy. It wasn't just about a potential friendship, though that was certainly part of it. It was about feeling seen, truly seen, by another person. It was about the unexpected joy of discovering a kindred spirit right next door, hidden in plain sight all this time. The subtle tension of our accidental touches, the shared glances, the easy flow of conversation. It all pointed to something new, something that felt both exciting and wonderfully calm. My quiet life was beginning to feel a little less quiet and a lot more interesting. And I realized, with a sense of quiet wonder, that I was genuinely looking forward to whatever came next. The rhythm of our interactions found a natural, unhurried pace after that first coffee on Arthur's porch. There were no grand declarations, no sudden shifts, just a gentle unfolding. Sometimes it would be a shared few minutes over the hedge, discussing the progress of our respective gardens, my roses, his meticulously tended tomatoes. He'd offer advice on dealing with aphids, and I'd share a particularly good bloom from my prize-winning dahlia. Other times, one of us would find an excuse for a slightly longer chat. I accidentally made too much zucchini bread. He happened to have an extra copy of a gardening magazine he thought I'd enjoy. These small exchanges became anchor points in my week, quiet moments of connection that I found myself anticipating with a surprising degree of pleasure. We learned more about each other in these snippets of conversation. I discovered he had a dry wit that surfaced unexpectedly, making me laugh out loud. He learned about my lifelong, though mostly dormant, passion for watercolor painting, something I hadn't picked up a brush for in years. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after our coffee, I was struggling to carry a heavy bag of mulch from my car to the backyard. My back had been twinging a bit, and I was probably overdoing it. Suddenly, Arthur was there, emerging from his front door, as if summoned by my silent grunts of effort. "Eleanor, let me help you with that," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Oh, Arthur, no, I'm fine, just being stubborn," I protested, though relief was already washing over me. He didn't argue, just gently took the bag from my hands. "Nonsense. That's far too heavy for one person. Where would you like it?" His proximity, as he stood beside me, was noticeable. He wasn't a large man, but he had a solid presence. I caught a faint, pleasant scent, something like old books and freshly turned earth, uniquely Arthur. As he easily lifted the bag I'd struggled with, I felt a pang of something akin to gratitude, but also a warmth that had little to do with the saved effort. "Just by the new flower near the maple tree, if you would. Thank you so much, Arthur. You're a lifesaver." He carried it with an ease that surprised me, then set it down carefully. Happy to be of service. He wiped his hands on his trousers, then looked at the half-prepared bed. "Putting in some new perennials?" "Trying to," I said, rubbing my lower back. My enthusiasm sometimes outstrips my physical capabilities these days. He gave a sympathetic smile. "I know the feeling. The spirit is willing, but the flesh protests." He paused, then said, "If you ever need a hand with the heavier work, Eleanor, please don't hesitate to ask. I have the time, and frankly, I enjoy a bit of physical labor. Keeps the joints from seizing up." His offer was so genuine, so straightforward, it disarmed me. "That's incredibly kind of you, Arthur. I might just take you up on that sometime." "I hope you do." His gaze lingered on mine for a moment, a flicker of something warm and unreadable in his eyes, before he nodded. "Well, I'll let you get back to it then." As he walked back to his house, I watched him go, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was gratitude, certainly, but there was also a growing sense of something more. A fondness, a deep appreciation for his quiet strength, his unassuming kindness. It wasn't just neighborliness anymore. This felt like the careful tending of a new, delicate plant, a friendship, perhaps, or maybe something even more nuanced, something that didn't quite have a name yet. The following Saturday, I was out on my porch, sketchbook in hand for the first time in what felt like a decade. Inspired by our conversations, and perhaps by the subtle stirring of new feelings, I'd unearthed my old art supplies. I was attempting to capture the play of light on the ferns Arthur had given me, the original one and a couple more he'd since passed over the hedge, spares from his ever-expanding collection. My hand felt clumsy, unsure, but there was a quiet joy in the simple act of observing, of trying to translate what I saw onto paper. I was so absorbed I didn't hear Arthur approach until his shadow fell over my sketchbook. I looked up, startled, a little embarrassed to be caught in my rusty attempt at art. "Oh, Arthur, I didn't hear you." "Forgive me for startling you, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft. He was holding a plate covered with a napkin. "I saw you out here, and I made scones. Clotted cream and strawberry jam included." He lifted the napkin to reveal perfectly golden scones. My heart did a little flip. Scones. His rustic shortbread had been divine. "Arthur, you spoil me," I said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. They look incredible. I was hoping you might think so. He hesitated for a moment. May I join you? Or am I interrupting your creative process? He glanced at my sketchbook. Not at all. Please, sit. I gestured to the chair beside me, quickly closing the sketchbook. And you're not interrupting anything, just witnessing a very rusty artist trying to remember how to hold a pencil. He sat down, placing the scones between us. I think it's wonderful that you're drawing again. You mentioned you enjoyed it. I used to, I admitted. Life just got in the way. But lately, I felt the urge to try again. I looked at him. You've been rather inspiring, you know. With your garden, your books, your appreciation for the quiet things. A faint flush rose on his cheeks. I hardly think I've done anything inspiring, Eleanor. Oh, but you have, I insisted gently. Sometimes it's the quiet inspirations that make the biggest difference. He looked pleased, a soft smile gracing his lips. As he served the scones, carefully spooning generous dollops of cream and jam, our hands brushed again. This time, it felt less accidental, more like a natural consequence of our proximity, of the comfortable intimacy that was slowly building between us. The touch was brief, light as a feather, but it sent a familiar shiver of awareness through me. I glanced at him, and his eyes met mine, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the gentle current that flowed between us. There was no awkwardness this time, just a quiet understanding. We ate the scones, which were, of course, heavenly, and talked. Not about anything profound, just the small details of our lives, our thoughts, our observations. He told me about a fascinating documentary he'd watched on migratory birds. I told him about a funny phone call I'd had with Clara involving a misbehaving parrot at her clinic. The conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by comfortable silences and shared smiles. As the afternoon light began to mellow, casting long shadows across the lawn, a sense of deep contentment settled over me. Sitting there on my porch with this kind, intelligent, gentle man, sharing scones in quiet conversation, felt right. It felt like a gift. Arthur, I said as he was preparing to leave, thank you. For the scones, for the company, for everything. He paused at the porch steps, turning back to me. His expression was serious, his gaze direct. Eleanor, he began, his voice a little deeper than usual. The pleasure truly is all mine. These moments, they mean a great deal to me. His words, so simple, so sincere, resonated deep within me. They mean a great deal to me too, I thought, though I didn't say it aloud. But I hoped he could see it in my eyes. He gave me a small, almost shy smile, then turned and walked back towards his own house. I watched him go, the plate of leftover scones still on the table, my half-finished sketch beside it. The air felt charged, not with tension, but with a beautiful, quiet energy, a sense of possibility. I picked up my pencil again, not to sketch the ferns, but to idly trace the rim of the teacup he'd used. The touch of our hands, the warmth in his eyes, his quiet words, they all swirled together in my mind, creating a feeling of profound emotional connection. It wasn't the dramatic, heart-pounding romance of my youth. This was something quieter, deeper, more resonant. It was a connection forged in shared solitude, mutual respect, and the unexpected joy of late-life discovery. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that what was growing between Arthur and me was something truly special. It was changing everything, not by appending my world, but by gently, beautifully enriching it.